my community, or a need with my students, or a need for whatever that I can fill, is this a necessary cost, right? It's different from reasonable. They tend to be lumped together a lot, but they have different meanings. And my husband reminds me of this all the time if I go out shopping and I'm like, oh my gosh, I got the best price, right? It was so reasonable. Yeah, but was it necessary, right? And that's the kind of the thought process here. It might be on triple sale clearance, but if you don't need it for your program, it's not necessary, and it's still not an allowable cost. Allocable goes to the proportional benefit, right? When I'm talking about allocable, I'm looking at the proportion it benefits my program. So and this is kind of wraps up with our discussion on sharing use of equipment, right? If I am going to purchase a piece of equipment that I will only be using for my Perkins program 50% of the time, the proportional benefit to my program is 50% of the cost of that piece of equipment. So I can only charge 50% of the cost of that equipment to my program. That's allocable. One of the biggest expenses for our federal program funds is salaries and benefits, right? And salaries and benefits really tie to this allocability thing with the time and effort documentation. Everyone's favorite. So I said there's two sections of the cost principles, and I said the first section is our basic principles, reasonable, necessary, allocable, and those others. And then the second section is the cost principles go through about 50 selected items of cost, and they detail additional or requirements or notes or caveats about those selected items and whether or not they would be allowable. Salaries, compensation is included in that caveat, right? And what they say is in order for salary to be allowable, in order for you to charge the compensation for employees to your federal funds, you need to demonstrate not just the payroll documentation that you keep just to charge to pay all of your employees. You also need to demonstrate that the employee worked and benefited the program, and so therefore their salary is allocable to that program, and the way you do that is through time and effort documentation. So payroll documentation tells me that my teacher showed up at 8 a.m. and left at 4 p.m. and took a sick day on last Friday and did, right? That's my payroll documentation. What payroll documentation does not tell me what that teacher did between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m., right? That's what your time and effort documentation has to show. That has to say, okay, I worked 50% of that day on a non-federal program, and then I worked 50% of that day on CTE program. So now I know, okay, based on the payroll documentation, the hours that they worked, and the fact that they have told me through this time and effort documentation the percentage of time that was attributed to my federal program, I know exactly that I can pay 50% of this salary price and I can charge it to my federal funds. You need both. You need both to support salary costs. So time and effort documentation is over and above what's required for just your general payroll documentation. One issue that we see, or that people kind of say to us all the time, but wait a second, Bonnie, we have job descriptions. That's how you know what the teachers did, right? It's not just, yeah, they showed up at 8 and they left at 4, but look, we have this job description that says what their tasks are, and we can use that job description with the payroll documentation, and that should be enough to charge it to my federal funds. I wish I could say that that was enough. Unfortunately, the rules are really specific as to exactly the type of documentation that you have to maintain to support salary costs. And included in those rules is an after-the-fact certification. So job descriptions are before the fact. There's no after-the-fact, check. You might have intended for that person to work 50-50, but what if after the fact the schedules change and all of a sudden they were really 75-25? I wouldn't know that based on the job description. The only way I know that is if my teacher has certified exactly how they spent their time and how that time was divided. The good news is time and effort documentation requirements are changing significantly. The current rules have very specific forms that have to be used, including, who has to sign and how often they must be signed, etc. Under the new rules, all it says is you have to have sufficient documentation and internal controls to make sure that you prove allocability. I mean, that's basically all it says. So it backs off on whether or not you need to have someone sign every month, or whether or not they need to, whether or not a supervisor can sign, or it has to be the employee. All of that stuff has kind of gone to the wayside. Under the new rules, they don't care so much about the exact form that you use, just that you have the controls in place, that if somebody came in and they looked and they asked you, okay, I see that you're paying Bonnie here for Perkins. I see that you charge 50% of her salary to Perkins. I'm going to interview her and see how she spends her time, and it better match up. Otherwise, your controls are not working, and you're not paying people appropriately. I know that's a lot of information. Question?
When you look at is there a time frame within which that 50% has to be achieved? For instance, if you're paid through two different funds, and essentially you're going to be paid, work half a year on one fund, half a year on the other, but you're being paid from two funds throughout the whole year. So
the question, just in case you guys didn't hear over here, let's say I'm working on two projects. I have two different funding streams. However, my first project is for the first 6 months. My second project is for the second 6 months, and I'm getting paid 50-50 throughout the year. So my first 6 months, I have to say 100% project A. My second 6 months, I would say 100% project B. And then at the end of the year, it would reconcile and be 50-50, right? That kind of process is fine as long as you maintain the documentation. Reconciliations of how so those forms that I talked about, the time and effort forms where you have someone certifying how they actually worked, they have to be reconciled with the payment, right? Because obviously that person is getting paid, whether they're telling you that, whether they're working on Perkins or not working on Perkins, they've been budgeted and they're being paid based on how they're budgeted. But then you look at how they certified how they worked, and then you have to adjust the payment that came out. So if I budgeted them for 50% Perkins, and at the end of the year, by looking at two projects, they were 50% Perkins, no problem. However, if at the end of the year my documentation shows, they only really spent the first 25% of the year on Perkins and then 75% on non-federal, well, now I have to make a reconciliation and an adjustment based on that. So the reconciliation period can be a year long, if particularly in that kind of circumstance. It's for secondary folks, it's supposed to be quarterly. Post-secondary, it says periodic, but at least annually. So either way, if you have a year period, it should be fine. Any other questions? Okay, I know that I did not go through a bunch of slides, but I really wanted to highlight those sort of pieces before. These slides, like I said, they really just highlight what's new from the old requirements. So if you're familiar with the old requirements, you can kind of go through these slides and see what's new and what's changed. One of the new sections talks about prior written approval, which essentially says that you can request prior approval if you are unsure whether or not a cost is allowable. I've heard your state basically begging you guys to talk to them if you're not sure. So it sounds like you have a good responsive group here at the state to deal with that. Another one that I wanted to highlight is this issue on administrative costs and indirect costs and the relationship between the two. The department, or the OMB and the COFAR, when they issued these rules, they were concerned about folks direct charging administrative costs and then also collecting on indirect costs and essentially getting a windfall of administrative costs, right? And as I heard noted in your application, the indirect costs you collect are within your administrative cap, right? To the extent you want to direct charge administrative costs, you have to meet these 4 conditions under the new rules. These 4 conditions don't exist in current rules. But under new rules, to the extent you want to direct charge any administrative costs